She was born in absolute silence. She never heard her own mother's voice. He has never heard a song, an I love you, not even the sound of rain. But something impossible happened in Rome. In the midst of thousands of people in St. Peter's Square, Pope Francis looked her in the eye and said his name. What came next changed her life, and it can change yours too. Watch now this real and deeply moving story of faith, miracle, pain, and transformation. An intense narrative that is touching hearts all over the world. Subscribe to the channel to receive more stories that transform and heal. Share with someone who needs to listen, even in silence. Since I was little, my world was silence. Not the calm silence that soothes, but the one that weighs, that suffocates. A silence where the sound of rain was just an image through the window, where the laughter of the other children was a movement of lips without meaning, where the screams of adults were nothing more than vibrations in the air. I was born deaf, totally, without any hearing, without promises of improvement. And as much as the doctor said that I could have a normal life with effort, nothing was ever normal. Growing up deaf is like living behind thick glass. You see it all happen, but you never really participate. I was the only child of simple parents, from a village in the interior of Argentina. People of faith. Faith, by the way, was the only thing my mother had in excess. She said that God spoke from the heart, and that I, even without hearing with my ears, could still hear things that no one else heard. As a child, I believed. I prayed every night with my eyes closed and my forehead leaning against the image of Our Lady hanging over my bed. I asked to listen, any sound, even the wind, a dog barking, my mother's voice. But what I received was silence, always, and that silence turned into anger, then frustration. As a teenager, I no longer prayed. My heart hardened, and all that innocent faith turned to sarcasm. Does God hear everyone except those who were born deaf? I once wrote in my journal. That became a mantra that I repeated in my mind every time my mother insisted on taking me to church. Time passed. I graduated in literature with the help of interpreters. I started working as a proofreader in a Catholic publishing house. Irony of fate, perhaps. I read and corrected texts about miracles, faith, hope. But in me there was no more room for that. Just a routine without noise, and a heart that has learned not to wait for anything else. It was then that, on an ordinary afternoon, while I was organizing a prayer book for publication, something caught me. It was a passage that spoke about the gifts that are born of suffering. God permits pain not to punish us, but to reveal us. My eyes stared there much longer than they should have. That phrase didn't leave my head in the following days. I saw her in dreams. I imagined her written in the sky. I began to feel an absurd restlessness, as if something was trying to tell me something. Inside, without sound, but with weight. Not understanding why, I began to look for more religious texts. I read about transformed lives, about pilgrims who traveled to Rome and came back with impossible stories. Stories of meetings with Pope Francis, Argentine like me, human, simple, compassionate. Someone who, even though he was a world leader, hugged beggars in the squares and cried with mothers who had lost their children. I felt like seeing him, not to ask for anything, not by miracle, but because something in me said I needed to be there, in St. Peter's Square, face to face with that man. The problem is that my life was too small for that. Short salary, obligations at work, no fluency in Italian. Such a trip was unthinkable, but the thought wouldn't let me, day and night. Until, on an impulse, I wrote to the Publishers Foundation asking for a 15-day leave. He said he needed a spiritual journey. Then, I looked for tickets on discount sites. I sold my bike. I asked a childhood friend who lived in Rome for help. She said she could host me for a few days. I don't know exactly how, but 3 weeks later, I had in my hands an envelope with a one-way ticket to Rome, a prepaid card with hard-earned euros, and a letter from the publisher wishing good spiritual winds. The night before the trip, my mother came into my room and handed me an envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. Daughter, maybe you don't know, but every night I pray that God touches you in a special way, not with sounds, but with presence. Go. and carry this desire in your heart," I cried. And for the first time in years, I knelt by my bed and prayed. No sound, no words, only with a full chest. Something was beginning to change, but I still had no idea what was coming. The plane took off on a golden evening. As we flew over the clouds, I looked out the window and wondered what, in fact, I expected to find. A blessing? A look? A moment of peace? The strangest thing was to know that I was going to see and hear a man, and I couldn't hear. What sense did that make? It was like running to the sound of a bell, knowing you'll never hear it. But there was something about that trip that couldn't be explained. I arrived in Rome early in the morning. The city welcomed me with that enchanting chaos. Horns, scooters, tourists everywhere, churches on every corner. But for me, everything was still silence. But for some reason, that silence seemed different, less oppressive, as if it were about to be interrupted. On the second day, my friend helped me fill out the form to participate in the public audience with the Pope on Wednesday. He said that it was not guaranteed to be close, that there were thousands of people, that many could not even see him up close. I nodded. It didn't matter. Being there was already more than I could imagine. The night before the audience, I went alone to St. Peter's Basilica, entered. That place seemed like another world. Soft lights, tall stained glass windows, art everywhere. I sat on one of the benches for hours, just watching people pray, light candles, cry. A girl passed me with a lighted candle and dropped a note next to me. Got. It was written, "Listen to what cannot be heard." A shiver ran down my spine. I looked around, but no one seemed to notice anything. I kept the note with me. My heart was pounding. It was as if something was about to happen. I walked back home slowly. That night, I lay with my eyes open for a long time. When I finally slept, I dreamed of a crowd. Everyone was silent, but the Pope was in the center, looking directly at me. And then he said something. Something I didn't hear, but I understood. I woke up with tears in my eyes. The hearing would be in a few hours, and I had no idea that on that day, among thousands of people, he would speak my name. I woke up before the sun. The sky of Rome was still steeped in a deep blue, speckled with golden clouds that were slowly beginning to stretch over the horizon. The streets were almost empty, except for a few hurried nuns and sleepless tourists. My body was shaking, not from cold, but from something bigger. Anxiety, perhaps. Fear. Hope. All mixed in a way that made me tremble, as if my skin knew that this day would be different. I got ready in silence. I put on a simple white blouse, a gray coat, and in my pocket, I kept the note that the girl had dropped in the church. Listen to what cannot be heard. The phrase burned my chest like hidden embers. I took the subway with my friend to the nearest Vatican station. We followed with quick steps, as we knew that the lines would be huge, and they were. As I turned the corner of Via della Conciliazione, I came across a crowd. Thousands of people forming a human sea toward St. Peter's Square. Flags of several countries flew. Children, the elderly, priests, young people, religious and atheists, all there for the same reason. My heart tightened. I felt small, invisible, a needle in a haystack. How could I, deaf, isolated, with no visible signs of suffering, be noticed in the midst of all that? My friend pulled me by the arm and we smiled. She spoke slowly, making gestures that we had agreed before. He said we would be near an area where the Pope used to pass by in a Pope-mobile. It wasn't guaranteed, but maybe, if he looked. We went in and positioned ourselves as close as possible. There was still almost an hour to go before the hearing began, but the place was already buzzing. Everyone talked, sang, clapped. For me, it was a visual bubble, an intense movement, but without sound. But something was different. For the first time, that silence did not completely isolate me. It was like I was in the center of a mute hurricane, watching everything, feeling everything, as if I were connected in another way. A Spanish priest sitting in front of me noticed me, smiled. He showed a small wooden cross around his neck. He took my notebook and wrote, May the light of God touch you today." I smiled back. That simple gesture brought a tear to my tears. A sign. A reminder that I was alive, present, even if the world around me spoke languages I couldn't hear. The minutes passed. And then, people started to agitate. The Pope-mobile was approaching. The whole body of the crowd leaned towards the central thoroughfare as if a wave was forming. I stood on tiptoe, trying to see between heads and arms raised with cell phones. And suddenly, there he was, Pope Francis, with his calm smile, waving, touching hands, blessing objects. The world seemed to freeze around him. People cried, screamed, spread rosaries, photos, handkerchiefs. And I simply watched him. I stood still, not knowing what to do, without having a voice to shout, no sign that he could see me. I felt invisible again. For a moment I thought about lowering my head. To accept that perhaps my presence there was symbolic, spiritual, but not concrete. A representation of silence, a testimony without the need for an audience. But then, the car slowed down. The Pope looked everywhere, slowly, as if he were looking for something. Or someone. My heart pounded. He was getting closer and closer to our rank. And then, without warning, he stopped looking around. And he fixed his gaze. In me. It was a second. Maybe 2. But I felt it. I felt as if time had stopped. As if the crowd had disappeared. As if there were only the 2 of us. And in that second, his eyes narrowed slightly, in a smile that seemed to recognize something. He leaned slightly to the side. My friend noticed, touched my shoulder and said something. I didn't hear it, but I saw its expression. Surprise. Hope. The Pope-mobile stopped. He gestured to one of the Swiss guards. He pointed discreetly in our direction. The guard approached, looked around, approached me and my friend. Something was going on, but I didn't understand what. My heart was beating so hard that I could feel every pulse in my neck. The Pope got out of the car, and then he walked slowly towards us, surrounded by security guards. The people around started to agitate, but again, everything was silent for me. My eyes couldn't tear it away. I was in shock. I couldn't hear anything, but I swear. At that moment, my whole body seemed to pick up a sound I had never known. He stopped a few steps from me, smiled, and then, looking straight into my eyes, he spoke, and I understood. I didn't hear it with my ears, but I understood, and it was my name, spoken with a tenderness that is impossible to describe. There was no voice, there was no vibration, but it made sense. There was presence, there was light. I cried, and I fell to my knees. The guard approached, held my arm, but the Pope signaled with his hand, "Let it." He touched my head with affection, and while everyone was screaming, photographing, crying around, I was there, in the center of the world, surrounded by something I never imagined feeling. A sound that was not sound, a voice that came from within, a connection that crossed the impossible. And then, he whispered once more, and my whole body trembled. That touch on the head was like a silent explosion inside me. There was no sound. There was no audible word, but my whole body vibrated as if I had heard thunder that only I could feel. The Pope held his hand for a few seconds, while his eyes remained fixed on mine. I didn't know whether to cry with emotion or incredulity. Maybe both. Behind me, my friend sobbed. People around huddled together, trying to understand what was happening, trying to record the moment with their cell phones. But nothing could capture what I felt inside. After looking at me once more, with an intensity that I have only seen in a mother's eyes, he turned and went on his way, guided by the guards. Everything moved around me again, as if the world had taken the pause. The crowd went back to screaming, singing, applauding. But I stood there, kneeling, holding my face with my hands. Tremendous. Something in me had been broken. Or maybe, finally opened. My friend helped me get up. His eyes were red. She said something to me, slowly, gesturing for me to understand. He said his name. He spoke, looking straight at you. I nodded with tears in my eyes. I knew it. I had understood. I don't know how. I don't know where. But I understood. That afternoon, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the balcony of the apartment, watching the sky change color. The Vatican still seemed to pulsate in the background, even in the distance. And everything inside me seemed to now thaw. An old memory came like a whisper in the memory. I was 8 years old. She was sitting alone in the schoolyard. The other children played in circles. I tried to follow the gestures, the laughter that I didn't hear. I wanted to participate. I wanted to laugh too. I approached the group, but when I arrived, one of the girls pushed me lightly. She doesn't even listen. She doesn't know how to play. I saw his lips forming the words. Even without sound, it hurt like a slap. That day, I went home and locked myself in my room. My mother tried to get in, but I wouldn't let her. I stayed there until dark, hugging my pillow. It was there, in that deep silence of childhood, that my revolt began. Not against children, nor against deafness, but against God, because he could do anything. And even then, he did not give me a voice. It didn't give me sound. He didn't give me a chance. But now, there in Rome, after that impossible moment, I realized that perhaps he was trying to reach me in another way, inside, in ways that I still didn't understand. I started to write compulsively in a notebook, about everything I felt, everything I saw, about the feeling of having been called. I wrote and cried, as if each word wrested from me years of accumulated pain. And while I was writing, something new grew, an immense desire to talk to other people like me, people who carried the same kind of silence, that they had choked faith, who felt forgotten. The next day, I went to a small church near the apartment. I entered alone. I lit a candle. I knelt down and, for the first time in a long time, I really prayed. Not a memorized prayer, but a sincere conversation with the invisible. I asked for understanding. I asked for direction. I asked for strength to continue feeling what I had started. As she left the church, an elderly lady approached. He handed me a folded paper. I looked at it, surprised. Open. It was written, "Listening is not about ears. It's about soul." My eyes filled with tears again. I didn't know that woman. She just smiled and walked away. The coincidences were getting too intense to ignore. I returned home and spent the night revisiting every moment of that meeting with the Pope. I started writing a text, a testimony. But the more I wrote, the more old memories surfaced. Memories I had buried. Like the day I heard my mother cry in the bathroom because she thought she would never hear me say, "I love you." Or the day I pretended to understand what a guy was saying during my first kiss, just so I wouldn't look different. Or even the day when a priest told me that maybe my deafness was a cross that I needed to carry. And suddenly I realized that this meeting was not just a magical moment. It was a breaking point, an open portal. Something inside me needed to come out, to be healed, transformed. But that wouldn't just come with tears, not even with sweet words. That would require courage. It would require facing everything that was hidden behind my deafness. It would require listening, even without sound. The next morning, my friend woke me up with unexpected news. One of the Vatican's assistants had left a note at the building's entrance. It was an invitation. My name was written on it. It was to return to St. Peter's Square in 2 days, a closed meeting. At the personal request of the Pope himself, my heart almost stopped. What did he want with me? The note trembled between my fingers. My eyes read and reread the words as if trying to find some hidden prank. But there wasn't. It was real. An official invitation. A private meeting, personally requested by His Holiness, and my name written in firm letters on the paper. My heart seemed to have become too small to withstand the avalanche of emotions that ran through me. My friend next to me smiled through tears. He tried to say something, gesticulate, but I could barely keep up. I was anesthetized. A part of me wanted to jump for joy, to scream to the world. Another part was terrified. Why me? Why? Among thousands of faithful, among so many requests, so many pains, so many stories, Had he chosen my presence? The answer seemed to be deep in my chest, still without words to be translated. I spent the rest of that day in a state of torpor. I walked the streets of Rome without really seeing them. I felt the wind on my face, the gentle warmth of the sun, the vibrancy of the city pulsing around me. But inside me, it was as if I was in another dimension, a place where everything was slower, denser, more loaded with meaning. At night, I lay in bed with the ticket in my hand. I didn't sleep. I relived every moment of the previous day, every look, every sensation, and a question echoed in my mind. What would I do if I could really hear in that meeting? Not with the ears, but with the heart. Would I have the courage to accept whatever came? 2 days passed in the blink of an eye. On the day of the meeting, I woke up even before dawn. I dressed in the best I had, a light blue blouse and a discreet skirt. I tied my hair in a simple bun. I took the note and put it in the inside pocket of my coat, as if it were a talisman. We arrived at the Vatican at dawn. The square was almost empty, unlike the day of the public hearing. A cold breeze cut through the air. Swiss guards led me to a small side entrance. There, a young and cordial Monsignor received me. He wrote on a piece of paper, "You will have a few minutes. Don't worry." I nodded, even though I felt my heart pounding in my chest. We walked through silent corridors. The marble echoed under our footsteps. The walls were adorned with centuries-old artwork, but I barely noticed. Everything inside me was focused on what was to come. We stopped in front of a heavy door. The Monsignor smiled and opened it slowly. Inside, in a simple, almost austere room, with a wooden cross on the wall and an open window letting in the soft morning light, he stood, Pope Francis. Sitting in a simple chair, looking out the window, as if contemplating something far beyond the landscape. When I heard the creaking of the door, he turned. His eyes met mine immediately, and in that instant, all fear, all anxiety, all doubt disappeared. There was a kindness in his eyes so deep, so immense, that it seemed to hug me without touching me. He got up slowly and walked over to me, smiled, and he did. Again, I heard no sound, not a word articulated by air, but I understood. "You have not been forgotten." The phrase resonated within me like thunder of light. My knees faltered, but I managed to stay on my feet. Tears ran down my face without me trying to contain them. The Pope reached out and, in a slow and ceremonial gesture, placed something in my closed hand. I instinctively closed my fingers around the cold, small object. Then he touched my shoulder, firmly, as if confirming a mission. And then, without saying anything else, he guided me to a small table in the corner of the room. On it, there was a white envelope. The Pope looked me in the eye again and pointed to the envelope. I opened it with trembling hands. Inside, there was a handwritten letter. Not in Latin, not in Italian, but in Spanish. In my native language, a personal text. The first lines read, "Daughter, the sound you are looking for has never been in your ears. It has always been in his heart. God has been talking to you all your life. You just needed to listen with the awakened soul." The words shuffled before my teary eyes. Further down it was written, "Now, take this message to the world. Show the forgotten that they are the most remembered. Be the voice that echoes in the silence." My chest expanded with such a strong emotion that it felt like it was going to tear my skin. And then, at the end of the letter, a bold line, "Are you ready to hear what's coming next?" I looked up. The Pope smiled, and then he motioned for me to come even closer, and whispered something that would make my whole world change forever. His whisper seemed to pierce the very fabric of reality. It was not made of sound, but of meaning. I didn't listen. I understood. Straight to the heart. Each word was like a note of music that vibrated inside me, at frequencies that logic could not measure. The world is full of voices without sound, and of ears that hear but do not hear. You were chosen to be a bridge. Bridge. The word echoed in my chest with the force of a tide. A bridge between what? Among whom? Before I could ask any questions, he reached out again, touched the metal he had placed on my palm, a small wooden cross, simple but seemingly to carry all the weight in the world, and closed my fingers around it. "Do not fear what is coming." His words, or rather their meaning, hung in the air like a promise and a warning at the same time. He smiled one last time, and then an assistant approached discreetly, signaling that time was up. I bent slightly, trying not to collapse in sobs, and was guided out of the room. Every step he took through the corridors of the Vatican seemed heavier, more full of meaning. I was no longer the same person who entered there. When I left the building, the Roman sun was high, gilding the stones of the square. My friend ran to me, anxious, asking what had happened. I couldn't answer. I just smiled, and for the first time, I felt that my smile was complete. Nothing was missing. No absence of sound. No absence of meaning. We spent the rest of the day in respectful silence. We walked through narrow streets, past old fountains, hidden squares, small churches with half-open doors. Rome seemed to pulsate at a different frequency, as if it also knew what had happened. At night, sitting on the porch, I held the wooden cross between my fingers. The wind was blowing softly, and for the first time I heard the wind. Not with the ears, but inside me. I felt his movement, his dance, his silent singing. I closed my eyes, and I remembered. I remembered the first time I asked God, as a girl, why I was deaf. I remembered the nights when I would cry in secret, wondering why everyone could hear the simplest words, in "I love you," in "I'm here," except me. I remembered the revolt, the anger, the feeling of abandonment, and I understood. God has never abandoned me. He just taught me to listen in a different way. Listening to the invisible. Listen to what words don't say. Listening to the pain of others, even when masked by smiles. Listening to the loneliness of those who never ask for help. To hear hope stifled in hearts that cry out in silence. I was a bridge. Not a bridge between sounds, but a bridge between souls. I realized that my life would not be made up of great speeches or lectures. My mission was different. To be a presence. To be listening. To be a refuge for those who, like me, have lived too long behind thick glass, isolated from the world. I cried there, on the Roman balcony, until I had no strength left. And then he smiles. I smiled with my whole soul. In the days that followed, before returning home, I began to write. Not technical texts, nor editorial reviews, but stories. Small chronicles about the invisible. About the beauty of things that don't need sound. About love that communicates in other ways. My friend took me to a small bookstore near Piazza Navona. There, I found a simple navy blue notebook with smooth pages. I bought it and promised that I would record all the soundless voices that crossed my path. On the eve of my departure, we returned to St. Peter's Basilica. I went in alone, sat on the same bench as the first time, and closed my eyes. I didn't ask for anything. I just thanked him. For everything. By silence. For the pain. For the revolt. For the long wait. For every tear and every absence. Because now I knew. It was all part of a bigger plan. When I left the church, the sky was painted gold and pink. I took the subway back to the apartment. I sat by the window. I watched the world go by outside. Faces, stories, entire universes crossing at each station. And it was then that, in the reflection of the window, I saw something. Behind me, sitting discreetly on the opposite bench, was the same woman who had given me the ticket on the first day. That phrase, "Listen to what cannot be heard." She smiled at me. But before I could react, the composition braked and it descended, blending into the crowd. I stared into the void, trying to understand if it was real or imagination. On my lap, the new notebook seemed to vibrate. It was time to start writing. It was time to start being a bridge. But little did I know that when I returned to Argentina, my calling would be even greater than I could have imagined, because a new surprise was already waiting for me. Something that would change not only my life, but many others. The plane touched down on the ground of Buenos Aires with a slight jolt, but my heart was already in turbulence long before that. Returning home after everything I had experienced in Rome was like coming back from another life. The smell of the air, the hue of the sky, even the muffled sounds that I never heard but always felt, seemed different now. My parents were waiting for me at the arrival gate. When they saw me, my mother covered her mouth with her hands, as if she couldn't believe it. And my father, always restrained, wrapped me in a hug that seemed to want to glue all the pieces that were once loose. I embraced them as if returning from a war, tired, changed, but at peace. During the drive back to our small town, I watched the landscape through the car window, as if everything was new. Old houses, backyards with clothes on the clothesline, dogs sleeping on the sidewalks, children running after punctured balls. A simple world, but now immensely full of details that I had never really heard, even in silence. On the way, my mother handed me an envelope. "It arrived in the mail when you were still in Italy," he wrote in a note. I opened it with contained curiosity. It was a letter from the publisher where I worked, a proposal to write a book. Not about proofreading, not about grammar, but about my experience in Rome, about faith, about inner listening, about the invisible. I felt butterflies in my stomach. That scared me and excited me at the same time, because it meant giving voice to something that was not yet fully formed in me. But it also meant the chance to fulfill the promise contained in that phrase of the Pope: be a bridge. The following week, I started writing. With each page, I felt as if something bigger was leading my hand. The words flowed effortlessly. I recounted my childhood in silence, my struggles, my mother's faith, the rebellion, the trip, the meeting, but mainly the after, the invisible transformation. When I finished the first chapters, I sent it to the publisher. It didn't take 2 days for them to respond. They wanted to publish. Not only that, they wanted to launch the book as part of a larger campaign aimed at communities with hearing and visual impairments, an action that involved schools, churches, and cultural centers. And they wanted me to participate, traveling, talking, or rather communicating, with these groups. I was paralyzed for a few moments. In front of people, giving lectures. But then, I remembered the Pope's gaze. You were chosen to be a bridge. Accepted. In the months that followed, my life became a constant crossing, traveling from city to city, meeting people, listening to silent stories like mine, children who felt invisible, adults who had buried their dreams, mothers who still expected miracles for their children. In each place, I felt that wooden cross that the Pope gave me vibrated discreetly in the pocket of my coat, as if to say, go on. The book was released with a simple title, Listening to the Invisible. And to my surprise, it spread like a strong breeze that sweeps across the Corrado. I received letters, messages, videos, people from all corners of the country sharing how that story had touched something inside them. One of the videos came from a public school in the countryside of Salta, a class of deaf children watching the translated version of my testimony in sign language. All crying, all smiling. That took me apart. But the most impressive thing was yet to come. On a cloudy morning, I received a call from my friend in Rome. She was panting, emotional. I said that a European television channel had done a story about the meeting between me and the Pope, and that, for some reason that she herself could not explain, the video went viral. It has been subtitled in several languages. It has reached communities in countries in Africa, Asia, and even the United States. The following week, I was invited for an interview on national television. I was terrified. How to speak live, knowing that I could not always follow the lip reading of the presenters. But then, I took a deep breath and accepted. I took with me an interpreter and the wooden cross. And in that interview, as I was talking, or writing on the interactive digital whiteboard we used, I realized that it wasn't about perfection. It was about truth. What no one knew, however, was that something strange began to happen in the following days. Anonymous messages began to arrive. First, by email. Then, in letters. People saying that something strange happened when they read my book, that they felt sounds they had never perceived before, who had dreams with voices, that when they finished reading, they felt as if someone had spoken to them, even though they were alone. I thought it was a coincidence, or exaggerated emotion. But then, a priest from Mendoza wrote to me saying that while reading my book to a group of young deaf people during a catechesis, one of the girls, mute since birth, murmured a sound. For the first time in my life, that gave me goosebumps, but nothing compared to the last letter I received. It was written on aged paper, with careful lettering. There was no sender, but the content made me cringe. Said, "Daughter, what was started is not yet finished. You have awakened something, but now it needs to come back. Rome awaits you." I looked at the cross in my pocket, and at that moment, she fell to the ground. And it did. The cross fell to the ground without making a sound. But inside me, the bang was deafening. She had accompanied me from Rome. He slept next to me. I traveled with me in my pocket. I was present at all the lectures, in schools, in churches, in meetings with other deaf people like me. It was my physical link to that sacred moment, my silent anchor to everything that happened before the Pope's eyes. And now, in front of that anonymous letter, she just fell and broke. I stood there, paralyzed, staring at the small piece of wood split in two. One part had the base of the cross, the other, the top, separate, incomplete. I felt a stab in my chest. I took the two pieces, sat on the edge of the bed and tried to understand what it meant. You awakened something, but now it needs to come back. Rome awaits you. The words of the letter hammered in my head, as if they were part of a riddle that I wasn't ready to solve yet. There was something unfinished, something unrevealed, and for the first time since my return, I felt real fear. Not fear of the unknown, but fear of what had already begun to be revealed within me. The next day, I looked for my friend in Rome. I told him about the letter, about the cross, about the strange messages. She was silent for long minutes. He later told me that some people in the Vatican had noticed unusual movements, pilgrims who claimed to have visions after touching copies of my book, religious who dreamed of soft voices calling out their names. A French priest reportedly began painting images that he said were inspired by a bridge of silence that crosses faith. It seemed that an invisible network was forming, a chain of silent signals that escaped logic and reason. It was scary, but also inevitable. A week later, I bought a ticket. I returned to Rome. The city greeted me with a gray sky and an icy wind that seemed to whisper forgotten words. I went straight to the little church where it all began, where I first found the girl's note. Listen to what cannot be heard. I knelt on the same bench, placed the pieces of the broken cross on my knees, and closed my eyes. I didn't ask for anything. I just listened. And in the midst of that heavy silence, something began to happen. Images, fragments, sensations. I saw myself, small, sitting in the schoolyard, alone. I saw my mother crying silently in the bathroom. I saw the Pope looking at me in the square. I saw the cross fall. I saw people touching my book and crying. And then I saw faces, many faces, of people I have never seen, from places I didn't know. Everyone looked at me. Some smiled, others were just waiting. And in the background, behind everyone, a standing figure. The same lady who handed me the first note at the Vatican. She was there, and now he smiled. I woke up with a strange sensation, as if something had been sewn inside me during the trance, something that finally united me completely. On the way out of the church, I found an envelope taped to the door, my handwritten name. Inside, a simple note: "You are now the bridge. The sound the world needs is not in the ears. It is in listening. Listen and walk." I left there toward St. Peter's Square, alone. The sky began to slowly clear. The clouds parted like curtains, revealing the blue above. The Vatican was calm, almost empty, like a stage after the show. I sat on the steps and stayed there for hours, until a young priest approached. He asked permission to sit next to me. He took a book out of his pocket. It was mine. I heard you would come back. I dreamed about it 3 nights ago. In my dream, the Pope told me that the bridge had been built, that the word now needed to be passed. I stared at him, not knowing what to say or write. You're going to speak in the square, at the next hearing. Your story will be told. Live. For everyone. The world needs to listen to you. My heart raced, but before I could react, he handed me something, a new wooden cross, identical to the previous one, but with one detail. In the center, engraved with fire, the words in Latin, Audi Veritatem, listen to the truth. On the morning of the hearing, thousands of people crowded the square. Me in the center, next to the Pope. The crowd was waiting, and when my moment finally came, I got up. I held the new cross to my chest. I took a deep breath, my interpreter next door, and then I closed my eyes. And I did. I spoke from the heart, with the soul, with everything that was in me, without sounds, without voice, but with truth. The entire square fell silent. The kind of silence he hears, the kind of silence that transforms. At the end, the Pope stood up. He hugged me in front of everyone, and he said, with his eyes full of water, "She listened." And at that moment, everyone listened. Not a sound, but something bigger, something that echoed beyond the ears, something that will never be forgotten. If this story touched you, leave a heart in the comments. End.